I would like to apologize for our starting 10 minutes late. I was held up for personal reasons and was not able to come earlier. I would just like to refer to a matter of access. I know there are persons with visual disabilities who are going to be listening in, connecting via Zoom. So I just would like to ask those who are going to speak before requesting the floor to please identify yourself, tell us what organization you belong to, and what position you hold. Thank you very much. This hearing is about the rights of persons with auditory disability in Chile. I am going to divide the time in the following way. 20 minutes first to civil society, 20 minutes to the state, 20 minutes to the ICHR for its observations, 20 minutes once again back to civil society. I'm sorry, 12 back to civil society, 12 to the state, and then we will close, and that will take no more than 6 minutes. So I give the floor now to civil society organizations for 20 minutes. And please don't speak too fast for the interpretation into English. Good afternoon, distinguished members of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, Mr. President, commissioners. I greet the delegation of the state of Chile and those who are listening in from afar, remotely from Chile and elsewhere. I am Marcelo Salamanca. I'm a clinical psychologist and a member of the Fundación en Sesiones. Now I would like to address two matters involving inclusion of deaf people, the impact that this has on their lives. If we don't address this, we are going to continue witnessing the devastating effects not only of deaf people, but everyone close to them. I'm talking about education, access to the mental health of people who are deaf in our country. First, I would like to first address the challenges in the implementation of a school inclusion in Chile. As we know, there is a legislation that ensures the right to education in Chile. Unfortunately, in practice, many schools don't have the necessary training or resources to provide a truly inclusive environment to deaf people, deaf students. According to Ministry of Education data, students or people with hearing disabilities, we have 200,000 people with some type of disability. Now, we know that this number is probably larger, given that this data only reflects that those students who are enrolled in public education. 87% of these students who are hearing challenged in 2014 are spread across 1,600 schools, and they receive support from a school program. However, records show that only 10% of these schools have interpreters available to them. 70% of these establishments prefer to have only a few students. That is, most of them have to go to school in which there is no special service provided for them, and they are with the population, the hearing population. Now, of the 6 schools, there are only 6 schools remaining for hearing challenged students. Now, of those 10 schools, 9 have as their main language for learning Chilean Sign Language, and this enables us to suppose that in the other 4 schools, only the people who teach are hearing people who don't really have full command of sign language. Now, we have a law on social inclusion of persons with disabilities, which calls for a framework to ensure inclusion in education of deaf people. However, its application falls short because there isn't enough resources made available. There's a lack of accessible material for hearing challenged, and also given a lack of awareness among authorities about those in charge of offering the pedagogical material that would be tailored to the needs of the hearing challenged. And this is a culturally and linguistically minority, and to this effect, in Chile, we don't know what the necessary minimum is to implement in an intercultural way, and for there to be bilingual education in schools. At least 2 languages have to be taught differently. That is the verbal teaching and for hearing impaired. Now, the law in Chile ensures a regulatory framework based on the respect for hearing impaired to have access to education, and their sign language should be considered their first language. However, evidence shows that bilingual schools for deaf people allow for the development of sign language teaching, which has an influence on the variability of linguistic experiences. Now, if a deaf person or hearing person cannot learn in his or her native language, then that makes it difficult to learn any other language, and that's going to have an impact on their human development and their social inclusion in schools and even in the workplace. This is what we call language privation, and this is a fundamental issue. The right to one's language is one of the fundamental rights. Now, even in this regard, this also has bearing on the academic success of hearing impaired. And there have not been enough studies focused on how this affects one's education. Now, there are a number of studies that show that, on average, adult hearing impaired people usually don't have an educational level that goes beyond 4 years of primary school, and you have to consider the benefits of being literate has and not being literate has on a person. Now, it's urgent for actions to be taken enabling students of the deaf community to have access fully and systematically to bilingualism within the schools. That is, their first language, sign language, should be taught, and the written language would be their secondary language. I would like to stress that there is no law that defines the inclusion of deaf children in schools, and considering the needs and traits of the deaf population, not enough is being done, because in order for them to fully develop their academic potential, linguistically and culturally, that needs to be done. Now, that would not be possible if schools in which they are don't enable for their inclusion. So we make a call upon the state of Chile to strengthen its commitment to the education of deaf people, allocating sufficient funds for this purpose, as well as making available didactic material, and to ensure that schools are truly culturally and linguistically appropriate and inclusive, fostering the full active participation, academic development of all people who study, regardless of their auditory traits or abilities. So we ask the state, through its ad hoc organization, to implement the following measures. First, to focus on educational establishments with specialized integration methods to receive deaf people with a differentiated curriculum, and also to make sure that teachers are properly trained in teaching the hearing impaired. Third, the professional training of deaf people with cultural sensitivity such that they're fully included, ensuring the rights of the deaf community according to the linguistic norms that we have enshrined in our laws and the also international agreements. 4, to foster the presence of deaf teachers as well, favoring the learning process and command of sign language, so that the interaction between students and teachers would be better, and also a sense of belonging of the hearing impaired in school. And to do this from a bilingual, intercultural, intersectoral approach from an early age. I'm talking about mental health, social development, and education from a rights perspective, with emphasis on early diagnosis, as well as interdisciplinary assistance of families, including teaching sign language to the whole family. 6, to implement measures enabling to learn what the cultural needs of the hearing impaired are in schools. 7, to ensure that there are qualified interpreters made available in keeping with international standards. 8, there should be the linguistic education of sign language within schools, and deaf researchers should be involved in that research. 9, that sufficient funds be allocated by the state to implement policies and programs that would ensure quality education for deaf people, implementing the law, the aforementioned law. Now, regarding the mental health of these students, which is the next thing I want to bring up, it's absolutely necessary to underscore the innumerable barriers that deaf people encounter to have access to the different public and private health care, mental health care. 10% of the population of Chile have some type of auditory disability. However, the supply of mental health services adapted to the specific needs of this population are very limited. Without a doubt, access to mental health services for deaf people is conditioned by a number of factors, including cultural barriers, linguistic barriers, and communication barriers. A lack of understanding of the deaf culture by mental health professionals makes it hard to establish a sound therapeutic relationship, and there's not often access to qualified interpreters. Makes it very difficult for the mental health care provider and the deaf person to interact and understand each other, and that leads to even greater difficulties by deaf people. Now, just like any other human being, we know that deaf people have any number of mental health concerns, but given the communication barriers, these conditions aren't always identified, or they aren't dealt with early enough or appropriately. The International Institute of Deafness in this country says that deaf people are more likely to suffer from mental health disorders than the regular population. Therefore, the World Health Organization estimates that 20% of deaf people throughout the world have a mental health problem, which means that that's twice as much as in the hearing community. Now, the deaf population, given the fact that there are barriers of communication, as their language is not understood, or an understandable language is not provided to them, they suffer problems of their identity and other difficulties, and children are among the most vulnerable children, 3 times more prone to suffering from sexual abuse, physical abuse. Now, the greater prevalence of disturbances isn't only the result of auditory difficulties, but the fact that they're forced to adapt to hearing contexts, and then they don't have proper access to health care, mental health care services, and this ultimately falls short of their needs. Now, the deaf community faces considerable barriers. According to a 2018 study, only 10% of deaf people who need mental health services actually receive such services. Now, if we're going to talk about linguistically and culturally appropriate services, the situation is that much worse. Now, we know through research that's been done in 2020 that under 20% of the mental health services offered to deaf people actually come with an interpreter. Means that the care given falls short. Now, of 100 deaf people that need care, only 10 will receive it. Now, of those 10, only 2 are going to actually get the proper service with an interpreter. So that is owing to a number of causes. Now, many healthcare providers aren't fully aware of the specific needs of the deaf population. That's why, well, another study in 2019 points out that less than 15% of mental health professionals said that they had received specific training on how to provide services to the hearing impaired. This leads to discrimination and exacerbates the existing mental health difficulties. Now, as far as that is, people with disabilities, deaf people, are more likely to suffer from sexual abuse than the general population. This is greater vulnerability, which results, among other things, from the barriers of communication, as I mentioned, the lack of culturally and linguistically sensitive environments, and also the fact that they are not provided with sexual reproductive information. They face a number of difficulties related to health care, limited access to proper services, a lack of prevention services, a lack of mental health services that are linguistically appropriate to their circumstances, more discrimination, a lack of awareness among the mental health professionals. Now, I should say that as far as the existing norms, there are international instruments that call for specific care to be provided to this specific population that would protect and promote their mental health, offering alternatives of treatment. The International Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities sets forth a number of principles regarding the mental health of deaf people, among which access to healthcare services, including access to proper and quality mental health care services. There should be made available sign language interpreters and other communication support means, being able to take part in decision making, which means ensuring that deaf people have the opportunity to express their preferences and their opinions about the care and the treatment that they are receiving in mental health care, and respect of their autonomy and dignity, the right to follow certain treatments of mental health that respect their autonomy and dignity, as well as the right to be treated with respect and consideration in all aspects of their mental health care, including that they be the right to prior and informed consent. Now, it's very important that mental health of deaf persons be promoted to ensure sexual services that are proper, taking part in decision-making, respecting their autonomy. This is enshrined in the Inter-American Convention as the Inter-American Convention against all forms of discrimination against persons with disabilities. I should also say that Chile ratified the American Convention in 1990, and in 2002 the other, and the UN Convention in 2008, pledging to ensure equitable access to health of all persons, even those with auditory disabilities. However, the truth is the lack of sign language interpretation in healthcare settings, the lack of a properly trained staff, and the absence of specific policies to address these needs keeps people in a state of ongoing exclusion regarding mental health. The Belfast Declaration from 2010, which is another instrument which addresses the specific mental health needs of deaf people, which promotes equal access to mental health services for this community, says the following. First, access to mental health services that be of quality, including availability of properly trained professionals in sign language and providing qualified interpreters when necessary. Second, recognizing the deaf culture and the importance of understanding, respecting it in providing health care service, including culturally sensitive approaches to care. 3, the participation of the deaf community in the design, implementation, and evaluation of mental health services to ensure that it be effective and culturally germane, and the proper training of mental health care professionals on the specific needs of deaf people. Because of the foregoing, we urge the Chilean state to take concrete measures, first, to ensure equitable access to mental health services, that they be culturally and linguistically accessible and appropriate, with sign language interpreters made available in person or remotely, and to raise awareness and to train mental health care professionals so they can understand what the unique needs of deaf people are, to offer effective and culturally appropriate treatment. 3, for the deaf community to be involved in the design, implementation, and evaluation of mental health care programs, something that would ensure that the proposed solutions be culturally sensitive and appropriate for deaf people. 4, to advocate for equitable access to information about mental health in accessible formats, such as sign language, accessible written material, and online courses addressing the needs of deaf people. Lastly, to take the necessary measures to support deaf people in decision-making, to inform them on their mental health and access to whatever services they need. This means to respect their self-determination and their ability to actively take part in their recovery process and their mental health. To conclude, as everyone here must have understood, access to mental health services and inclusion and education of deaf people in Chile faces large challenges, which calls for the state's urgent action to ensure that their human rights be upheld. We have to address these problems to make sure that deaf people exercise fully their human rights, the rights which are the same rights of any other person, that they be fully included in Chilean society. Now, the day of zero discrimination of deaf people in March, this is a call to action for the Commission to follow up on this as necessary to promote and protect the rights of people throughout the region, including deaf people. Thank you.
Por esa brillantísima intervención.
Thank you very much for your brilliant presentation, Dr. Salamanca. I would now like to yield the floor to the State for 20 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, Commissioner Carlos Bernal, Commissioners Caballero and Vulcan, the Assistant Secretary, Maria Claudia Pulido, Marcelo Salamanca of the Fundación Enseñas, and those who are with us virtually, many of those who have sought the hearing, Veronica de la Paz, and Joli Marin, who is the director of the School for Deaf Persons, and Jorge Oti as well. The first thing is that the President of Chile is grateful for the appeal made by the organizations that have requested this hearing, the gist of which is not only reasonable, but is also consistent with the rights-based perspective with which the state of Chile addresses the design and implementation of public policies. This does not mean, of course, that these are enough. This is part of the effort. But that view expresses a will to go forward in a comprehensive and participatory manner. To that end, we believe that this session is extremely useful. From this perspective, Chile reiterates its commitment to the Inter-American human rights system to faithfully carry out the obligations acquired by the state in this form as well as in the universal human rights system. Similarly, we acknowledge the work that the Commission does throughout the hemisphere with these thematic hearings. As we have seen, these are part of promoting an environment of dialogue, joint evaluation, and good faith. In this regard, the state of Chile works from the understanding that despite the major efforts made in health and education regarding the exercise of rights on the part of deaf persons and persons with auditory disabilities, there still remains a great deal to be done to be able to consolidate the gains and generate optimal conditions for the well-being, comprehensive development, and learning of this population group. As regards this hearing, the state will address the human rights situation of deaf persons and related and the aspects raised by the petitioner, first in light of the constitutional provisions, and then Alejandro Alvarez, who is the human rights attaché of the permanent mission of Chile to the OAS, will develop the question of access to mental health services for deaf persons. And finally, Andrea Cantuarias, who is from our Human Rights Division, will address access to education for students with auditory disabilities and deaf students. After the promulgation of the Inter-American Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Persons with Disabilities and the UN Convention on the Human Rights of Persons with Disabilities, we have seen in Chile strengthening of our internal or national provisions, especially in the last 15 years. In 2010, a law was adopted on equality of conditions and social inclusion of persons with disabilities. 2 years later, in 2012, the regulation of the National Registry on Disability was approved. Sometime later, in 2019, the right to preferential health care for older persons and persons with disabilities was created. And then, not so long ago, in 2021, Chilean Sign Language was recognized as the official language for deaf persons. These are just some of the legal and regulatory gains. Now, on this last point, and since the request for the hearing is related to this issue, we think we should note that our legislation not only recognizes sign language, but also defines it as a natural, original language and an intangible heritage of deaf persons, as well as an essential element of their culture and their identity, both individual and collective. Similarly, Chilean law recognizes the cultural and linguistic rights of deaf persons, ensuring access to education, healthcare, and all other areas of of life in society in sign language. This recognition has been very important for the various gains and for further gains to be had. At this point, I would like to yield to Alexandro Alvarez. Thank you very much, Ambassador. As regards the mental health of deaf persons, noted by the requesters in their presentation, which I will address right now, there is extensive international evidence, as recently indicated, that shows that auditory loss is associated with anxiety and depression disorders, among others, which could be explained by the social isolation to which persons with hearing disabilities or deafness are exposed. In this regard, the objective of the Chilean state is to go forward with integral and inclusive solutions that enable persons with auditory disabilities and deaf persons to exercise their right to health at all levels of complexity and in all areas of health care, particularly including mental health. This is in line with the clear commitment of President Gabriel Boric to the mental health of the entire population, and this finds expression in the adoption of public policies that adopt a mainstreaming approach to or the cross-cutting approach of such as with the human rights approach. This includes universality, equality, and non-discrimination, access to information, and social participation. The public health agencies in Chile, however, have identified two main challenges related to the right to health of deaf persons or persons with auditory disabilities and for the exercise of this right. The first has to do with access to benefits that already exist in the health system. This, as was said in the requester's presentation, not all healthcare establishments have a sign language interpreter or professionals who are devoted to working with deaf persons and their families so as to guarantee universal access. In view of the foregoing, it's been necessary to collect information on local experiences that have been successful to promote a relevant approach that facilitates the access of deaf persons to health care. And so, in the context of carrying out the inclusive health policy on which the Ministry of Health is working at this time, good practices have identified in 4 local public health agencies, the health services of Arica and Parinacota, Antofagasta, the central metropolitan area, and in Los Rios. All of them have incorporated interpretation in Chilean Sign Language and the use of pictograms in order to facilitate care for patients. The second challenge has to do with getting access to more specific information than that which already exists, developed broken down by patient, making it possible to visualize the precise needs of the deaf population in respect of mental health. They also define the percentage of professionals and technical personnel who should have specialized training and for designing training programs for healthcare teams in the public network. The statistical information of the Ministry of Health is consolidated around benefits and not persons, so it's not yet possible to identify quantitatively and precisely the needs of the deaf population as regards mental health services. Moreover, the National Plan for Auditory Health Care and Care of the Ear for Chile, which seeks to improve access to health care for persons with auditory disabilities or deafness, considers trainings in the different types of communication, including reading, lip reading, and Chilean Sign Language. The goal by 2025 is to have 40% of all staff in the health networks to be trained in the different types of communication. And by 2027, for 2027, the goal is 70%. In addition, from the central level of the Ministry of Health, a technical guidance on rehabilitation for persons with auditory loss or auditive loss and deaf persons is being developed. It incorporates from in a multidisciplinary perspective a psychosocial expert as in an intervention together, which would be made up of two persons, with a psychologist and a social worker. In addition, there's a program, Salud Responde, which is available 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, which provides information, guidance, and support for users on various health-related issues. That platform has Chilean Sign Language interpreting, psychologists for mental health care, and other professionals trained in psychological first aid. To these initiatives is added a remote service for suicide prevention and the dissemination of informational videos on different areas of healthcare, both in Chilean Sign Language. Finally, we should note that next Wednesday, March 6th, a participatory dialogue will take place in a gathering that brings together civil society organizations, and the Institute on Deafness, which has requested this hearing, will participate together with deaf persons, persons with auditory disabilities, professionals from the area, and representatives of the state. This dialogue has been called Hammering Out Strategies for Inclusive Health Care for Deaf Persons and Persons with Auditory Loss, and the purpose is to address the concerns of the citizenry and identify existing barriers and come up with joint proposals to develop guides in the care network. The idea, and this also was mentioned by the petitioners, the requesters. I now give the floor to Andrea Cantuarias, who's an attorney from the Human Rights Division of the Foreign Ministry, and she's going to refer to access to education for deaf persons. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Alexandro. On a preliminary basis, the state should refer to special education or differential education, which is understood in Chile as a modality of the education system that cuts across all levels of education. That is to say, early childhood education, basic education, middle education, and higher education in schools for both regular and special education. This modality provides a set of resources, services, knowledge, and support to address the special educational needs that some students may have, be it on a temporary or permanent basis throughout their schooling. So the modality of special education is used mainly in two contexts. The first of these, as was already noted by a colleague from the civil society, we have school integration programs through which the regular schools receive additional financing from the state to provide specialized resources and to collaborate with teaching staff in providing support to students who face certain barriers in access, participation, and learning. Second, there are also special schools, and they serve the purpose of ensuring quality learning for children and adolescents when, due to the nature and type of disability, it's not possible to integrate them into the regular classes. In both cases, school integration programs or special schools, financing is provided through a special differential subsidy by the state per student enrolled. Now, as regards the school population with auditory disabilities, and was already noted by the civil society representative, it should be noted that the Chilean educational system has more than 2,300 students in this situation, and most of them attend establishments that have a school integration program. Specifically, and as indicated by Fundación Enseñas in its request for hearing, Of this group of students, 2,010 are enrolled in integration programs and just over 300 in special schools in that regard. The Minister of Education has developed a technical guidance for schools that have deaf students. This is a public policy that was developed taking into account the opinions and needs expressed by the relevant social sectors, by deaf persons and persons with auditory disabilities, and by teachers and principals with vast experience in this area. This is all for the purpose of coming up with a participatory diagnosis or assessment and an adequate design of conceptual and pedagogical guidelines that make it possible to offer a quality educational process that is also pertinent and relevant to the particular characteristics of this population group, allowing for their own linguistic and cultural development. In this way, the technical guidance propose curricular adaptations for deaf students compared to the common national curriculum. These include adaptations for access to the common national curriculum, as well as adaptations related to the learning objectives. In the first, we find the presentation of the information of the ways in which one can it has to do with adapting the space, the time, and we find the prioritization of certain contents and the enrichment of the national curriculum. Now, I want to dwell for a moment on this last curricular adaptation because it's especially relevant, given that the contents related to the their own deaf language and culture, as well as the varied forms of expression, are elements that enrich the common national curriculum, understanding that the contextual and biological diverse biological and contextual elements make a significant contribution to the quality of learning, and not only curriculum-based learning, but also social learning. For this reason, the state promotes a diverse classroom in which deaf persons can interact with hearing persons, but also with other deaf persons and other persons who have auditory disabilities, so as to bring about greater opportunities for interaction, favoring the development of interculturality and bilingualism, and improving the possibilities for a truly effective inclusion. One successful example, and I'm grateful that the director of the Chilean school is here, Dr. Jorge Ote. This Chilean school is a clear example of bilingual intercultural education, and it receives financing from the state. This school, because of its important educational proposal, inclusive, accessible, and innovative, received the 4th Ibero-American Prize for Education and Human Rights recently. As the ambassador indicated at the outset of the state's presentation, precisely because of the significant gains that have been made in the last 15 years in both education and health, the Chilean state is convinced that it must continue working on the challenges that persist. These include the need to endow greater resources to early childhood education. This is a fundamental stage for the development of language and the communication of the language and communication of deaf persons, and it lays the basis for the cognitive, social, and emotional development of this school population. In addition, and even though there's state efforts to promote and make available to the faculty courses for improving sign language and school learning, these initiatives will be strengthened and improved upon, moving towards the professionalization of deaf educators and Chilean sign language interpreters. In addition, we'll continue giving impetus to other proposals and training with the higher education institutions for the purpose of giving an effective response to the needs of children and adolescents from early childhood onward. Finally, it's important to strengthen educational spaces with deaf students so that a larger number of deaf students and adults can converge in such spaces, all with a view to making optimal use of the resources provided by the state, bringing about conditions for developing sign language and Spanish, ensuring integration and inclusion of deaf students to ensure their participation in progress in learning, and thereby contribute to more equitable education for deaf persons and persons with auditory disabilities. This concludes the remarks by the state. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. And thank you for your remarks. I am grateful for the presence of this very high-level team from the state. I would now like to give the floor to the members of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights for up to 20 minutes. I'll begin with Commissioner José Luis Caballero. Good afternoon. Thank you very much. Chairman, Commissioner Carlos Bernal, Commissioner Balkan, the Assistant Executive Secretary, Claudia Pulido, Marcelo Salamanca, thank you so much. And I'd also like to thank the representatives of the state and Ambassador. Thank you so much for being here this afternoon for this important presentation that you've made on the issue that we are addressing. Briefly, just one consideration. A lot has been said about the educational level, the importance of access to different levels of education for persons with hearing impairments, and this must intersect with if the persons in primary education are children or adolescents. The Inter-American Commission is clear on the need for a differential approach and to understand intersectionality, for as the Commission said in a very important report on guaranteeing rights, the perspective of children with disabilities changes and requires maybe a greater adjustment because of these two conditions. And a judgment of the Inter-American Court occurred to me. It's a very important one, González-Jut against Ecuador, and how what is exclusionary is not the disability itself, but rather the prejudices, the discrimination, the failure to integrate persons. Plus, there not being a human rights perspective informing some of these spaces. Now, I have a question on participation that has two aspects, or two prongs. The first is whether, with a view to providing care for persons with auditory disabilities, adjustments are made to procedures before the justice system so that persons can participate when they need to prove some action, or also in the if the school environment is not compatible with a person with an auditory disability. What is the justice system doing in Chile so that there can be some adequate compliance with Article 25 of the American Convention? This in terms of the justice system. And the other aspect that I'm interested in asking about is whether there are affirmative actions for persons with auditory disabilities to incorporate them into the public sphere, and also the possibility of holding government positions and elective positions.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I also join my colleagues in welcoming the members of the requesting party and the representatives of the state. And thank you very much for your respective presentations. I'd like to begin with your very frank acknowledgement and reiteration of Chile's commitment to human rights generally, and your commitment to enacting these policies to recognize and address these problems that have been raised here today. Non-discrimination is a very basic norm at international law, as well, including our own system in the Inter-American system under the Convention and in decisions interpreted by the court. As you've mentioned as well in your presentation, there are domestic laws that provide for non-discrimination and that address social inclusion. So given this domestic framework and international and regional framework, I guess what I'm curious about is whether efforts have been made within Chile domestically to raise these issues. You've raised some very, I think, serious problems in terms of access to education, access to health care, the kinds of problems that you highlight can have long-standing implications and impacts for persons who are affected. So lack of education, meaning, that can hamper someone for the rest of their life. So I'm just curious as to what kinds of efforts have been made to engage with domestic authorities on these very issues. And I'm assuming because of the persistence of the problems that you've mentioned, are there impediments beyond resources that need to be addressed? Are there any impediments that you can share with us that perhaps might help, if you identify them, that can work towards a solution? That's one. I note that you said on the 6th of March there will be a dialogue, which sounds like an extremely big step in terms of, again, addressing this. What I'm wondering, is there any, just from a practical point of view, is there any existing, and I'm sure there must be, but just asking, is there any existing state agency or department, ministry, a department in a ministry, which can address these things in a more sustained and ongoing manner? So yes, the dialogue that is planned for next week can obviously address, I think in a long-term kind of policy way, but in terms of ongoing and sustainable action, is there somewhere, some specific department where representatives of the association, your association, and the national authorities can continue to engage in these issues? Ultimately, though, I welcome the state's commitment to addressing these issues, and I'm sure the benefit of and I must thank you, the requesting party, because I'm sure one of the benefits of this is to provide some impetus and hopefully resolution of these problems. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Bulkan. Quisiera ahora dar la palabra a la secretaria.
I'd now like to give the floor to the Assistant Executive Secretary of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, Maria Claudia Pulido. Thank you very much, Commissioner, Chair. Well, I'd like to especially greet the civil society organizations as well as the illustrious state, and thank you for all the information that you have brought to us. As you know, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights is, with the leadership of Commissioner Carlos Bernal, producing a report on the situation of the rights of persons with disabilities in the Americas. Indeed, a consultation was made public, and a questionnaire was sent out that was responded to by a good number of states, including Chile, as well as more than 100 civil society organizations. So this information that we're receiving is extremely important for that report. I have 4 questions, 2 for civil society, and these refer to the participation of organizations of deaf persons and schools in the design of public policies and mental health policies. And the other would be whether there is a specific example of violations of the right to free and informed consent and the adoption of decisions related to mental health by deaf persons in Chile. And as the technical team for this has 2 questions for the state. First, has to do with the mechanisms that have been made available to ensure the presence of Chilean Sign Language interpreters in public services that constitute basic services such as health and education, and how does one monitor the quality of education and the delivery of adequate support to deaf students who are in inclusive environments? That would be it, Chair. Thank you. Thank you, Assistant Executive Secretary. Well, I'm not going to use all the time that remains to me for comments. I am merely going to highlight several things in my capacity as the rapporteur for persons with disabilities. Dr. Salamanca, I'm most grateful, first, that you've requested this hearing, second, that you came here, and third, for the content of what you've put before us. If I had money in my rapporteurship, I would go with you to every country and say the same thing, just change the name of the country, including the United States and Canada and the Caribbean. And I am sure that in all of these places, what you have just said is needed. It's my impression that in this hemisphere, we are in an extremely precarious state when it comes to addressing the rights of persons with disabilities, and particularly here, the rights of deaf persons. Second, I very much value, well, first of all, the openness of the state, the commitment of the state to the rights of deaf persons. And as the ambassador said, and quite rightly so, I think this is an opportunity for improvement, to have a positive agenda going forward. I also see the different barriers. And let me tell you a personal anecdote. In my earlier life, I was a member of the Constitutional Court of Columbia, and I received a request for special protection from a deaf student from a public law school. And this student was asking for something most reasonable. He was asking first to have that his classes should have be interpreted. Second, that the interpretation be done by more than one interpreter. I've already seen that here we've had rotation of the interpreters because that's very intense work. You can get tired very quickly. So we undertook research in this, in coming up with the judgment, and we realized that in order to, well, first of all, we did not find any jurist who was familiar with all of the subject matter in the law studies and who could provide a interpretation of sign language of them all. And second, we added it all up, and it would have cost a fortune for that university. So I understand the barriers, budgetary barriers, but those budgetary barriers cannot be an excuse to just stay on standby. So I bring this up to continue this dialogue for a few more minutes. I would like to raise the following. Number one, are there some technological developments that can help us in this regard to make the reasonable adjustments that deaf people need in the two spheres that were raised, education and also mental health care?
Two, how does the state foresee the future design to offer assistance to deaf people, disabled people, generally speaking, as far as an allocation of resources sufficiently large to create the necessary programs or affirmative actions and interventions that don't just cover these two areas, but access to the market is the mere fact of their being citizens to be able to vote and to take full part in society. And vis-a-vis the courts. I would also like to ask the state about the state establishing requirements for businesses, private businesses, to also accommodate deaf people, or private universities. Are there minimum standards set by the state to meet a certain threshold of care requirements for the hearing impaired? 12 minutes now to Mr. Salamanca, then back to the state. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. President and Commissioners. I would like to go back to what President Bernal. Now, that is ultimately what the reason we were asking for this hearing, to address these matters. Now, there are a number of things that we could address, and we have to make a distinction between school and mental health care. Now, over the last 15 to 20 years, there's no doubt the state has made efforts. Strides have been made, even beyond what was expected, given how long we had gone without there having been much done. But that said, it's never enough to fully meet the needs. I agree with what Commissioner Bernal said. This is not just an economic issue, because if we address it that way, we're not going to arrive at a solution. But this comes down to the full understanding and how we conceive of what it means to be a deaf person, what the challenges that people face, and what this entails for the state. Now, as the state lawyer said, she reeled out the different advances that have been made, and that's true. We carried out a project on inclusion recently in which that was addressed, and here at the OAS. But this isn't something that we see throughout Chile. It may be a reality in some places, but not throughout the country. Now, also, maybe 103 deaf people's needs are being met. But if you look at everything that happens throughout the rest of the region, it's really quite precarious. As I said at a certain point in my presentation, we advocate for inclusion, but how do we organize that inclusion? You have deaf people who are being spread out among different institutions that don't necessarily have the necessary understanding to provide the teaching, the pedagogical resources that students need. Something else that's very important in each region, for example, if we could zero in, focus on some schools and to build on the knowledge that some schools already have, exactly what is implied, what it is entailed in fully incorporating a deaf student, for others to learn from that. Now, so many schools don't have sign language interpreters, so we're going to talk about the development of cultural and linguistic skills. You must have teaching in sign language. And so to enhance the situation of deaf people, what's been done is not sufficient. Now, regarding the question posed by the Assistant Executive Secretary, civil society organizations that look out for deaf people, we have, without a doubt, engaged with the state more and more. Over the last 10, 15 years, we have been consulted with on a number of topics. However, that has not led to solutions. As I said, has not solved all of the shortcomings. Now, as regards mental health, progress has been made. We cannot deny that. But I'm sorry, we have not fully met the needs. We are in debt. This is not something that can only be solved by making interpreters available in the mental health care settings. It's important to understand what it means to be a part of a socio-linguistic cultural minority, a little bit like migrants, just to give you an analogy. And sometimes this idea that everything can be solved by providing an interpreter, when you consider the precarious teaching of sign language, that has actually led to greater problems to some degrees, because a lot of people have received some training in sign language, but not enough for them to actually serve as an interpreter as is required in a mental health care setting. Someone capable of communicating effectively with the therapist. But beyond that, understanding what deafness is, and that's where we also run aground and find some difficulties. Now, regarding a question posed by the President regarding technological technology that could help us. Yes, that has helped us, and more can be done. We right now see how Zoom is helping us with interpreters appearing on the screen and providing that service. That's a good example of technology being brought to bear. Now, far more could be done. A greater impact can be achieved such that everyone in mental health be trained and receive sign language training. Now, to expect this to actually happen and for every mental health care provider to achieve command of sign language, given the relatively small number of people who speak in sign language, is not likely to happen. Now, every now and then the state does spend a lot of money in training in sign language, but this learning in sign language, or maybe indigenous language, sometimes is squandered, is lost with these one-off expenditures on training that then aren't followed up on. So there needs to be a better understanding of what deafness actually entails. It's more of a cultural and linguistic approach. And that's very important for that understanding to exist, especially when the time comes to offering the necessary treatment and therapy to people. I don't know if I overlooked any of the questions that were asked. Thank you very much again for those clarifying responses. I give the floor now to the state. Thank you very much, Mr. President. These are many different topics, and this is truly part of a dialogue, a long dialogue. Now, 5 days from now, there's going to be another milestone in this dialogue, but it needs to be broader. It needs to be more long-standing, lasting. Now, what the petitioner has said, the challenge is that we have or what was put forward by the petitioner, that is something we also believe in. It's a common understanding. And now, the question asked by Commissioner Vulcan, who said that in addition to resources, what other problems are there? I would venture to say that there is a robust problem, if you can say, as Commissioner Pu said, which is a cultural matter. We have a very long-standing history of exclusion. And in this long heritage and history of exclusion, we're trying to change our outlook so that together with them we can change practices, make resources available, ensure their rights. And the petitioner, I'm sure, understands how complex that is. And that challenge is greater than the available resources. We have to understand how people think. Generation after generation, change how society has viewed deafness. So the question asked by the President regarding the future and how the state sees the future, our country, Chile, is engaged in a complex problem right now, of social impact with contradictions and progress and backsliding, and that comes down to what we're talking about here too, as the President himself said when addressing how private businesses are regulated as far as providing rights. Now, the fact is that we are a paradigm case in Chile of governance of a private enterprise, and they're upholding rights. Now, we know that it's not just the market rules, but also rules of democracy and human rights that come into play regarding what you said about allocating resources, part of the debate and the social impact that we seek. We have a new fiscal pact, covenant in Chile, precisely for this reason. For Chileans to really enjoy their rights, especially those who've been excluded, how to manage the resources necessary to meet that social demand inclusion, and other things come to play. So we're asked, what about affirmative action and policies? That's also part of this this Gordian knot we're trying to cut. Now, there were some candidacies of deaf people. I worked with the current High Commissioner at the UN and another who were hearing impaired, and intersectionality comes in here because this particular person, Maria Salinas, when you think about her candidacy and the intersectionality of it, she had the necessary votes to be elected, but she was not elected because of the rule of parity, gender parity. That is, these are the ins and outs and the vicissitudes in these matters that make them very complex. I'm going to give the floor to Alexandro and then to Andrea. Thank you, Ambassador. I would just like to briefly mention the question asked by Commissioner Vulcan about a question that the Assistant Secretary Pulido asked regarding the mechanisms for the provision of interpreters and in the healthcare setting. Commissioner Vulcan, I would like to say that there is a public service that is devoted exclusively to the disabled, the National Service for Disability, and whose mission is to coordinate the public service actions. And many of the questions that were raised here speak to the possibility of cross-checking public records, making it possible for us to take stock of the full situation based on analysis that ultimately is going to inform the public debate, the provision of services, medical services. And so there is an ongoing challenge of administration, coordination, and there are levels of coordination which make the problem that much more complex. Now, there's a specific suggestion that would seek by 2027 to have 70% of the public health care network trained in lip reading and Chilean Sign Language. That is, 70% of the healthcare providers would have been trained according to this program that is being implemented. And the second is that as far as making sure that public policy is tailored to mental health needs, you have to include the patient. Now, the services for the disabled, that would enable there to be greater coordination between all of the different parties that come into play to fashion a proper policy. Thank you. Just by way of complimenting what Commissioner Bernal said, and you spoke of the interpretation in sign language and other public services. Now, in education, as in health, access, universal access is what we aim for. There's a platform to help people access public services. It's been a good experience when we held preparatory meetings with the Ministry of Education in the run-up to this meeting, and that experience in the Health Ministry was raised and that it could be replicated, just as Alexandro said, and as I said myself regarding the school system in Chile, the local experiences are very important in order to create public policy, fashion public policy. Social participation is indeed one of the cross-cutting approaches or principles in a human rights policy and public policy drafting, and it's very important to include that. Now, in this participatory dialogue that we're going to hold next week, that is one of the first cases in which education is going to be involved. That was convened by the Health Ministry, and the Education Ministry and civil society are also taking part, and that is a great venue for us to continue working with civil society. Now, regarding access to justice, although that wasn't the focus of this hearing, I remember what the Ministry of Education said. They cited an experience in the south of Chile in which there was a complaint lodged about the lack of access of deaf people to the schools. The regional coordinator of education took stock or made a registry of services provided in that region to make sure that services would be provided where needed. Because even though an order was issued that these services be provided, there simply weren't interpreters available to ensure full access to the services that the region was compelled to provide. So it's very important for us to hear from civil society because they oftentimes have their finger on the pulse. They fully understand all of the what's happening on the ground. So thank you very much. We thank you for holding this session and the content of the session. I do think this is very useful for us to address in the most participatory way, best coordinated way as we can to address this matter. Thank you very much, Ambassador. I don't know if any of my colleagues have anything they would like to add. If not, I too thank both parties for your wonderful contributions and participation in this hearing, and it is adjourned.
by Due Process of Law Foundation, the Instituto de Defensa Legal, IDL, the Center for Justice and International Law, and the Washington Office on Latin America. I greet the representatives of civil society. It's a pleasure to have you here. I also greet the representatives of the illustrious state of Peru. And I also welcome and introduce Commissioner Estuardo Ralón, who is also rapporteur for Peru, Commissioner Andrea Pochak, who is rapporteur for some countries, and also mobility, and also truth, memory, and justice. Also present is the rapporteur for freedom of expression, Pedro Vaca, and the executive secretary, Tania Renaud, and the assistant executive secretary for monitoring, Maria Claudia Pulido. Very well. Before we begin, this is important, before we begin, I would like to recall that the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights is celebrating 65 years of work committed to the defense and promotion of human rights. Thanks to the interest and support of the states and society so as to give life to the American Convention on Human Rights and the Inter-American Democratic Charter. Since 1959, hundreds of professionals have been through this institution, and thousands of persons, communities, peoples, have come to the Commission seeking protection, justice, and reparation. We celebrate 65 years of history with more than 100 on-site visits, with their corresponding reports, more than 1,000 precautionary measures granted, more than 750 reports on the merits, 220 friendly settlements, and 377 cases sent to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. All of that with victims at the center of our work and of our priorities. To ensure that this hearing is inclusive, we ask all participants to begin, this is very important, to begin their presentations indicating your name, your position, and the organization or institution that you represent. Subsequently, every time you take the floor, we'd be most grateful if you could once again state your name at the outset so that anyone with a visual impairment will be able to identify who is speaking. We also recall that the hearings are subtitled on Zoom. Anyone can activate the subtitles from your equipment and choose the size of the font. And they're also available at the channels of the social media channels of the Commission. Perhaps it's worth saying as well that, well, I was going to say for the purposes of interpretation, well, there is interpretation in English and Spanish. There's not interpretation in this hearing? Well, we were going to ask people to speak slowly, but yes, there is interpretation. Yes. In case anyone wishes to listen in English, we should note this. And so you need to speak slowly to help the interpretation. The time will be distributed as follows. Civil society, 20 minutes. The state, 20 minutes. Inter-American Commission, 20 minutes. Then we will go back and give the floor to the civil society groups for 12 minutes, and comments from the state, 12 minutes on the second round. Well, very well. With that, I give you the floor, and welcome. Thank you very much. Good morning. First of all, distinguished commissioners, Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression, and Executive Secretary, Assistant Executive Secretary of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. My name is Katia Salazar, and I am Executive Director of the Due Process of Law Foundation. This is a regional organization with more than 30 years of work to defend the rule of law throughout Latin America. I'd like to begin by thanking the Inter-American Commission for having granted us this hearing. I would note that it is happening in the context of a very serious institutional crisis in Peru that is having a negative impact on the stability and independence of Peru's institutions, putting at risk democratic values and the rules of the rule of law. In this process of institutional deterioration, the Attorney General's office has been a key actor. It has often been a victim, quote-unquote, on attacks and undue interference by actors outside the institution, but it has also been, at times, the perpetrator of similar actions against other institutions and also against members of the institution itself, as we'll see further on. Given the natural limitations on time, we are not going to undertake a comprehensive assessment of the situation of Peru's Attorney General's office. Rather, we're going to focus on the attacks and measures which, under the veil of legality, have a negative impact on the independence of the institution and its members. We recall that while the attrition at this organization, the Attorney General's office, has accelerated in recent years, especially the last years, it is not recent. In the last decade alone, 2 attorney generals have been removed on charges of corruption, and 3 other attorney generals have been removed for the same reason. At the end of last year, the acting attorney general was temporarily suspended because of an investigation opened up by the special team of anti-corruption prosecutors. It found evidence that this person had traded political favors with members of the Peruvian Congress in exchange for archiving the investigations in their cases. The Attorney General's Office of Peru is at a key moment of its history. At this time, it has been handed over to an acting Attorney General who's adopted some important measures to defend the institution's autonomy. Nonetheless, some members of the Peruvian Congress have been giving impetus to legislative initiatives to intervene in the public ministry and to remove the the Attorney General or top prosecutors has occurred during the presidency of Fujimori in the 1990s. One fundamental element for strengthening the Attorney General's office is the Junta Nacional de Justicia, the National Justice Board, which is in charge of the appointment, evaluation, and removal of all judges and prosecutors in the country. Next week, the Congress of Peru will decide whether to remove all of the members for facts related to only one member of the board. If this happens, it would further weaken the Attorney General's office. This hearing is coming, thus, at a crucial time for democracy and the rule of law in Peru. We hope that the measures and commitments which come about today in good faith will allow for changes in Peru's institutions that would help prevent the continued deterioration of democracy in Peru and would to keep it from being captured by corruption networks, as has happened in other countries of the region. Thank you so much. Illustrious Inter-American Commission, my name is Viviana Kristosevich. I am the Executive Director of the Center for Justice and International Law, CEGIL. And I am going to briefly refer to the intimate relationship that exists between the situation of the Attorney General's office in Peru with guarantees of human rights and democracy for more than 30 years. I've been monitoring the human rights situation in the region, and because of this, I can assure you that the situation we see at this time in Peru is not unique. The attempt at co-optation and use or manipulation of the justice systems is part of the authoritarian script that we've seen in the hemisphere and globally, tied to the progressive deterioration of democracy. In recent experiences in the region and worldwide, the manipulation and co-optation of the top levels of the administration of justice has happened through the improper interference in selection processes and by the criminalization of prosecutors and judges who are in charge of high-impact cases. Both dynamics under a veil of formal legality, that is to say, making illegitimate use of lawful or legitimate powers of the state. This is one of the most common paths for dismantling the rule of law. The facts that we will describe next are associated mostly with the situation of the Attorney General's office because of its role in preserving rights and fighting corruption and impunity. because a weak and manipulated Attorney General's office is clearly incapable of responding to the need for protection of human rights nationally and internationally. In our presentation, we will also focus on the National Justice Board because of its relevance in the appointment of prosecutors at all levels. The information we bring you today to the Inter-American Commission sounds an alert to the situation of the democratic constitutional framework in Peru. We understand that it merits reinforced and close monitoring by the Inter-American Commission, the OAS, and the states of the region so that the deterioration of the rule of law not go further, but rather that it be turned back. We are facing clear indicators of a risk of significant deterioration of democracy. To go into the situation in more detail, we are going to split up our presentation as follows. First, we will address the threats, external threats, that tend to attack the autonomy of the Attorney General's office. Second, the internal threats to the normal operation of the institution. Third, we will address the current situation, the measures adopted by the new Attorney General amidst the precarious situation, the fact that it's being besieged by those being investigated and by the Congress. And fourth, we will present our conclusions and relief sought. Thank you, and I yield. Good afternoon, illustrious Commission. My name is Ursula Indecoche. I am the director of the Judicial Independence Program at DPLF. I'm going to refer to the external interference and attacks by outside actors against the Attorney General's office in Peru. Unlike other countries of the region, the Attorney General's office is governed by a collegial body called the Board of Supreme Prosecutors. Is selected by a competitive process by the National Justice Board, and they in turn elect every 3 years the Attorney General. This institutional design has a purpose, which is to generate internal checks and balances when major decisions are to be made. The Constitution and the domestic law don't determine the number of Supreme Prosecutors, but right now there are 7 Supreme Prosecutors, and only 3 of them are occupied by full Supreme Prosecutors. This is an institution which, as of December 2023, had 8,300 plus prosecutors, of whom more than 4,000 are provisional. That is to say, almost 56% of all of the prosecutors in the Attorney General's office are provisional. We have identified 3 forms of interference by outside actors that have a negative impact on the autonomy of the Attorney General's office at Peru. The first is weakening the National Justice Board as a check on the power of the Attorney General. Second is abuse of political proceedings against judicial officers. And the third is the use of the criminal law to criminalize Supreme prosecutors and anti-corruption prosecutors. As regards the first, in March of 2023, the Congress approved a law, 3017-18, which seriously weakens the National Justice Board, or rather the Supreme Prosecutors. It weakens the Judicial Career Service in the following way. It allows for the Board of Supreme Prosecutors to be made of provisional prosecutors, and not only by full ones, which was the general rule before, with some exceptions under the previous regulations. Second, it allows for these provisional prosecutors of top rank to be appointed directly by the Attorney General, and it establishes that not only can they may lower-level prosecutors occupy this, but also lawyers from outside the institution who meet a certain profile for the position that's been redefined by the person serving as Attorney General. It also establishes that if there's no full Attorney General, then the Attorney General can be an outside person serving on a provisional basis. This seriously weakens autonomy, and it creates a provisional situation that could be indefinite at the highest level. We believe there are 2 main ways that the Congress, through this law, could have control over the number of full Supreme prosecutors in the Board of Supreme Prosecutors. First, the Congress can, as it's already been doing, remove, through impeachment, justice officers. Second, because the Congress has to budget the positions necessary for calling the competitive processes for the full judicial Supreme prosecutors. Otherwise, they can't convene these processes, and those positions will remain at the provisional at the highest levels. That means these positions could be filled by persons close to the Attorney General, who, instead of exercising a check on their power, would become an extension thereof. In addition to this law, there are other recent initiatives that have already been mentioned for intervening in the Attorney General's office and having all the Supreme prosecutors dismissed. We'll get into this later. The second route of interference is abuse of impeachment proceedings against prosecutors who are Supreme prosecutors and the National Justice Board, which is the one that appoints and evaluates and removes prosecutors at all levels. The most emblematic has to do with Soraya Dávalos, a Supreme prosecutor who in June 2021 was disqualified from holding the position for 5 years, facing accusations having to do with her legal views. Associated with this, she has also had to face a criminal investigation based on the same facts. In addition to these attacks on Supreme prosecutors, there are also impeachment proceedings against the National Justice Board. There are 4 constitutional accusations against all of the members of the board, and on 2 occasions, efforts have been made to remove them by summary mechanisms. At this time, there is a vote scheduled in plenary to decide next week, Thursday, whether all the members of the National Justice Board will be removed, and with that, the entity that is in charge of the Supreme prosecutors, but also those prosecutors who sit on the electoral courts or panels nationally and regionally. Finally, the Congresses and the members of Congress are also using the criminal law to intimidate and prosecute Supreme prosecutors and anti-corruption prosecutors. Pablo Sanchez and Avalos, both prosecutors, were denounced by Fuerza Popular political party, as well as others who are special anti-corruption prosecutors. And on the 15th last, there was an accusation that a new case would be brought against a prosecutor. After we made this the request for this hearing, a recent prosecutorial investigation against officials in power gave evidence of dealings between the Congress and the Attorney General to exchange the archiving of investigations or shutdown thereof in exchange for votes to to remove the National Justice Board and a couple of other considerations. This situation as evidence of the profound danger to democracy that can be brought about when political interests penetrate the criminal prosecution sphere. I yield. Good afternoon, all present. My name is Florencia Rayardo. I am director of the program for the Andean region, North America, and the Caribbean for CIDH. I'm going to refer to the internal measures that besiege and seek to attack the autonomy and independence of the Attorney General's office. Specifically, I'll refer first to the dismantling of teams of prosecutors. Second, to the criminalization through disciplinary procedures brought by or initiated by oversight of the Attorney General's office body against prosecutors. And third, the lack of adequate measures to protect the rights to judicial independence, life, integrity of some prosecutors vis-a-vis these actions. Regarding the first point, dismantling of prosecutorial teams since July of 2022, at least 10 prosecutorial teams who were in charge of corruption cases, money laundering cases, and human rights investigations were removed or suspended with no justification and sent to cover positions for which they don't have the experience. For example, the prosecutor was dismissed who was in charge of the white-collar crimes investigation. Here she was looking into a criminal conspiracy involving judges, lawyers, and business persons. Also, the prosecutor who coordinated that team was removed. She was investigating a corruption case involving various judges, including the sister of the former Attorney General of the nation. Another relevant example was of the prosecutor in charge of another investigation who was removed in November of 2023, just days after revealing the corruption network within the Attorney General's office that led to the subsequent suspension of the Attorney General. This shows that within the Attorney General's office, improper influences and the involvement of corrupt actors have infiltrated so as to maintain a pact of impunity. Now, the second internal risk that we've identified threatening the Attorney General's office comes from the key role that the National Oversight Authority of the Attorney General's Office has played in criminalizing honest prosecutors. The idea, or this body, is to carry out disciplinary investigations into prosecutorial activity and to receive any claims against prosecutors because of their conduct in office. Now, the current head of that office has met with personnel being investigated by the Attorney General's office, which is illegal. These processes were recently initiated are related to supposed statements by some of the prosecutors in the context of the investigations and has a twofold objective. It generates restrictions on their duty to inform and be accountable to the citizens as regards to investigations, and furthermore, even more important, it ensures impunity. At present, some of these processes have had negative consequences for some honest prosecutors, such as Rafael Bellavarba, whose beneficiary of precautionary measures. He was suspended from his position for 8 months. In these cases, the suspension entails, among other things, the loss of personal protection, medical insurance, forcing them to consider stepping down. Finally, as a third internal obstacle to the work of prosecution, we identify the institutional silence and inaction in the face of the serious risks to institutional independence, the threats, disinformation campaigns, stigmatization, doxing, and criminalization. Well, this commission is perfectly aware of these tactics which have been used against some prosecutors in Peru. The idea is to intimidate them from carrying out their work. This is common currency in Peru, as happened, for example, as my colleague just noted, with the prosecutor Zoraida Avalos, who, in addition to facing outside criminalization, was also victim of death threats, and she suffered the dissemination of her personal address. Also, Lavallato and Perez are other prosecutors who have been subject to such conduct. People have gathered in front of their homes. This is a part of these attacks. Yesterday, for example, was the most recent case at the home of Prosecutor Vellano. Despite this clear context of risk, such attacks are not investigated, which means it's not possible to deactivate the risks and stop them from recurring. In the face of these attacks, there's not been a clear single voice coming from the Attorney General's office. The office that oversees the Attorney General has prohibited it from defending itself, and the Attorney General's office has not made any condemnation or taken preventive measures. This not only incites greater violence against them, it also brings about a hostile environment for the prosecutors doing their work. It also has a serious negative impact on the democratic institutional framework in Peru. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. My name is Cruz Silva. I am a member of the Instituto de Defensa Legal. Has been noted for the last 2 months. There's Juan Carlos Guillen has been interim Attorney General. Since then, there have been important steps forward, though just a few, in the midst of the very serious improper influence already indicated and what has been inherited by the previous Attorney General. One of the serious attacks has to do with 2 proposals to intervene in the Attorney General's office. One has been presented to the Congress already, and it seeks to replace all Supreme prosecutors, including the Attorney General, by a National Assembly of Judges made up of 7 presidents of boards of superior prosecutors for 2 years. In light of all the foregoing, well, the Attorney General's office, as we know, is unfortunately the bounty sought to be captured by mafias that are investigated by the justice system. It's clear for civil society and even for the interim Attorney General who is here that the purpose of this anti-democratic outlash and against separation of powers is impunity. On July 1st, there was an organized crime and money laundering case. Other cases involved the President of the Republic, money laundering and serious human rights violations against protesters, also money laundering, and almost all the former presidents of the country have been prosecuted. In our second round, we'll put our petitions to the Inter-American Commission of the Peruvian State. Thank you very much. I thank you for your time and your participation. We'll now give the floor to the State of Peru. And Please just to bear in mind time. My name is Ana Gabriela Vasquez. I am alternative representative of Peru to the OAS. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, commissioners, and staff of the Inter-American Commission and representatives of civil society. Please receive cordial delegations from the delegation of the Peruvian state, made up of staff from the Ministry of Justice and Human Rights, the Office of the Human Rights Ombudsman, Attorney General's Office, National Oversight Office, Foreign Ministry, and the representation of Peru to the OAS. Chair, I'd like to convey the congratulations of the Peruvian state to the Commission on occasion of marking its 65th anniversary. Next, the Vice Minister for Human Rights and Access to Justice, Lino Piloto, will speak. Thank you very much, distinguished members of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, representatives of civil society. Good afternoon. On this topic, the executive has sought a swift solution to the situation respecting constitutional and statutory channels. And so on 9 January 2024, the President of the Republic headed up the situation of the Council for the Reform of the Justice System, which included the participation of the President of the Judiciary, the Attorney General, and the principals of the National Justice Board, Constitutional Court, Office of Comptroller General, and Office of Human Rights Ombudsperson. As the President noted, the purpose of the meeting was to find points of consensus so as to be able to achieve honest and efficient justice. In this regard, we salute the convening of this hearing by the Commission. Likewise, we express our willingness to address any questions or observations on the part of the organizations that are here, or for yourselves as well. I now yield to Raquel Cardenas Manrique, who is representative of the Attorney General's Office. Thank you. Good afternoon, distinguished members of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, representatives of civil society, and general public. Cordial greetings. Continuing with the presentation of the Peruvian state, I'll address the main aspects having to do with the situation of the Attorney General's Office and impacts on human rights. The Attorney General's Office is an institution that has existed for 42 years as an institution. And along the way, we have faced various complex situations as the result of adverse contexts in which our legitimacy has been called into question. Nonetheless, despite such circumstances, our institution has always emerged and gone forward thanks to the commitment and work of prosecutors and administrative personnel who are honest and committed with a vocation to serve, making sure that our functions are carried out in keeping with the law, the Constitution, and human rights treaties, acting autonomously and objectively and independently. And so we are here. We have prosecutors from all three levels here, provincial, superior, and supreme, together with the Attorney General, Juan Carlos Guillen. Despite this, it is undeniable that at this time we find ourselves in a situation that is complex for our institution. That is why we're here participating in this hearing, to be transparent about our actions and to make them known to the international community and the citizenry in general, and ask that you trust the Attorney General's Office, that despite the adverse circumstances, we will continue defending legality scrupulously. We will continue defending citizen rights and the interests of Peruvian society, carrying out our work of prevention and prosecution of crime. We highlight among the main actions for strengthening the subsystem of human rights in our office the establishment of 29 prosecutorial offices. This because of a resolution by the Board of Supreme Prosecutors of 2023. That measure has secured the presence of specialized prosecutors throughout the country, so as to promote bringing the prosecutorial offices closer to human rights defenders, journalists, victims of human rights violations, indigenous peoples, and the population in general. So, strengthening the prosecutorial work of the our institution will reduce the great distances and costs of travel to obtain evidence. This is reflected in the investigations of the subsystem specialized in human rights and interculturality, for example, in several emblematic cases that we are in charge of, such as the Cantuta case, the Barrios Altos case, and El Santa, Huanta 84, Chuchidos, Universidad del Centro, El Frontón, Huancapi, Cavitos, Azurojas, Marín, Gardenias, Soras, among others.
We do have an outstanding debt vis-a-vis the disappeared persons of the past in other departments of Peru, the main one being Ayacucho, which suffered the full blunt of the armed conflict. Not only the specialized prosecutors' offices on human rights in Ayacucho, the specialized forensic team, and other departments of our institution continue to work on the humanitarian investigations they're charged with to achieve the most positive results and to close this circle of pain that affects family members of the victims. So we do think it's very important for us to acquire mitochondria detection equipment to identify victims in this case, as well as in other humanitarian investigations. Now, we are fully aware that as civil servants and representatives of legality, we need to be transparent with society about what we do. That's why we've come here to talk about the measures we've adopted to address the very complex matters that the Attorney General's office has had to tackle. Now, the Attorney General, who was at this hearing ever since he took office, has adopted a number of measures which he is implementing progressively to respond to the situation that we find ourselves in, to safeguard and to ensure the governance of our institution, among which we have Delia Milagros being brought back to the Supreme Court Board. At this hearing, we have with us the Supreme Prosecutor, Ms. Milagros Espinosa Valenzuela, also the prosecutor. As a prosecutor, he has adopted other measures to the effect that all cases underway and those to be taken on have to be endowed with objectivity and full respect to due process of law and the rights of every party involved. Another measure adopted is the request of the Comptroller's Office to ensure that a administrative audit be conducted of the Attorney General's office. That is the prior Attorney General. Also, very important measures regarding prosecutors have been adopted, especially that which has to do with the criteria for determining who or appointing the special teams, with the priority placed on hierarchical rank and seniority and technical wherewithal. Also, it was decided to send a report to the National Board of Justice laying out what all of the vacant positions and those positions being held, so that to fill those vacant positions, there be a competitive process held to overcome the rates of or the backlog, as well as making the temporary prosecutors permanent, appointing prosecutors in the meantime, before there can be held any competitive process to meet the need. Another measure was adopted for gauging the performance of permanent and temporary prosecutors to ensure the efficiency and efficacy of their work. We also will make sure that the Office of Records of Prosecutors look out for compliance of requirements regarding the appointment of provisional prosecutors, make sure they're suited to the position based on their service record, and making sure that they meet all of the requirements before they are appointed. For example, there must be a clear presentation of the reasons why a request is made to terminate anyone, and if there have been any complaints lodged. Furthermore, the National Justice Board recently decided to appoint 3 new prosecutors as well as some provincial prosecutors to reduce the temporary positions, strengthening the principle of job tenure to strengthen the Attorney's Office. Furthermore, regarding the internal norms that govern the public ministry vis-a-vis resolution of the Board of Supreme Prosecutors at all levels, as well as representatives of workers, this initiative emerged as a necessary measure to enhance the administration in this fight to overhaul our institution, which is taking place across the board. We thank you very much, Madam Prosecutor, for your words. We give the floor to Juliana Giannino, who is in charge of the disciplinary body, of the oversight body of the public ministry or the Attorney General's office. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, members of this honorable commission. I will present on the behalf of the National Authority of Oversight of the Attorney General's Office work that has been done by the office regarding the freedom of expression of the prosecutors. Therefore, to start with what we have come here to do today, it falls to me to start by saying that in Peru, as an integral part of the system of justice, the National Oversight Body was created, which is in charge of overseeing all of the prosecutors at all levels, as well as all of the civil servants within the Attorney General's office, except for the Supreme Prosecutors themselves, which fall under the aegis of the National Justice Board. Now, this oversight function includes prevention, oversight, inspection, investigation, and initiating any disciplinary procedure if necessary. Now, given that as an oversight body that took on its function starting in September of 2022, in the case of should there be a disciplinary proceeding started, we are the ones in charge of making sure that that disciplinary procedure is in keeping with the corresponding law, upholding those disciplinary procedures that are contained in Article 9 of our Rules of Procedure, as well as international standards contained in a report titled Guarantees for the Independence of Operators of Justice, who are necessary. That is, which are necessary to ensure objectivity, independence of the position, as well as due administrative procedure. Now, that said, we, from the beginning of this office functions, we have been looking out for the full upholding of the rights of the those, that is, meting out justice in the cases of infractions perpetrated by prosecutors. 23 prosecutors have been removed thus far, 7 at the national level. More than 2,800 cases are currently underway that were before the preliminary investigation commissions, the disciplinary procedures, as well as the appellate level. Now, therefore, it's clear that the ANC, in order to not give rise to any impunity arising from improper actions by prosecutors, has been pushing forward certain cases without any concern or regardless of who the infractor, the prosecutors were, and only 54% of, that is, less than 2% of all of the prosecutors who are that we have shown any type of has it been found that they are not in agreement with our findings. With this. Now, regarding the question that's been asked, we would like to stress that what we have done and what we do fully respects independence of the prosecutorial function, which ensures the freedom of expression of the prosecutors. Now, that said, we understand that this exercise of freedom of expression is not an absolute law. It is subject to certain strictures that all representatives of law are made apprised, are made aware of as soon as they come into this line of work. Now, in Article 46, which states that any civil servant who, through any means of communication, thank you very much for that. Jose, that is the defender of the people has the floor. I am Jose Luis Caballero, members of the Inter-American Human Rights Commission. It's an honor for us to take part in this thematic hearing, and I would like to start by expressing my conviction of a democracy and to commend this supranational body for its outstanding work, taking part in meetings such as this one. It's very important. Now, Peru's Human Rights Ombudsman's Office is an autonomous body and an independent one, according to our Constitution. It was created in the 1993 Constitution. Its prerogatives and responsibilities are under Article 161, 162 of the Constitution of Peru, as well as in its respective organic law. For this reason, I can tell you that it does not fall under any of the branches of government. It is entirely autonomous. Now, over time, it has had many functions assigned to it, taking part in the national citizen security system, the criminal system, and in the Council for the Reform of the System of Justice. Now, in our country, unlike many countries in the region, the system of justice is organized on according to what the Constitution sets forth in a number of articles, and that is that the Special Commission charged with the competitive process to select the members of the board be made up of the President of the Judicial Power, the Prosecutor of the Nation with us here, the General Controller of the Republic, representative of the public universities and one of private universities, and the Ombudsman who presides over it. As you can see, this is a group that is sheltered from any political influence. So it falls to me, in representation of our institution, to make sure that the Special Commission focus on ensuring the transparency and honesty in the selection process of the 7 titular heads and alternates for the period of 2025-2030. Citizens elected given their outstanding professionalism and integrity, are the ones who are going to be in charge of carrying out such a noble and important role. That is, the National Justice Board is in charge of the selection and ratification of the justices of the court, as well as exercise and oversight function of the judiciary. Now, this current board is the one that appointed the current chief authority within the judiciary. He also takes part in the electoral system, or it takes part in the electoral system, assigning the electoral chief of the National Registrar. We are certain that the institutional principles that guide the functions of the members of the National Justice Board, such as non-discrimination and equality, legality, impartiality, honesty, due process, all is stipulated in Article 3 of the Constitution, ensure that those selected be of the highest degree of quality and that they be ethical. Therefore, it's very important to strengthen the state institutions in order to consolidate a true constitutional state of rule of law in which justice always prevails, as well as order. This seeks to create a more fair society in which each individual can fully develop him or herself, backed by a legal system that doesn't only protect rights, but also promotes a sense of collective responsibility, seeking common well-being. Now, it's understandable those concerns that have been raised by civil society here directly and in organized way, which compels us to exercise oversight role constantly to make sure that the state's activities be made known. Now, this is all being done to build a future that's based on the values inspired by a democratic system, which institutions, legal certainty, play a very important role. Thank you very much, President and members. We thank the members of the Commission, as well as civil society. The state stands by for any question you may have. Thank you very much. There's another round of interventions. I give the floor now to Commissioner Estuardo Ralón, who is the rapporteur of the country. We'll be starting with here at the head table of the Commission. So thank you very much, Mr. President. I would like to start by welcoming representatives of civil society and the illustrious representation of the state. The situation in Peru is one that I have paid close attention to as rapporteur and have done so for 4 years as a rapporteur over Peru. And over that time, I have been able not only to support the work of the whole team at the Executive Secretariat, as well as here in the plenary or on the ground in your country in historic moments with former President Sagasti, former President Castillo, and then the break from constitutional order, and the current President, Dina Boluarte. So I would just say that recently, September 25th of 2023, the ICHR issued a statement institutionally and said through a press communique that it was concerned about the fact that a summary investigation was being opened up against the National Board of Justice in the Congress. As has been said here, this is a key body to ensure the independence and suitability of those people, operators of justice, as well as electoral authorities. I do think it's very important in the 189th session to remind everyone that the ICHR has said that the removal of the National Board of Justice without respect of the due process of law and the principle of legality would substantively affect this institution's ability to function and would contribute to undermine the judicial independence in Peru. We also said at the same time that the political oversight mechanisms based on criteria of discretion for political reasons, given the very nature, run counter to the guarantees of independence and impartiality, which should be observed in any disciplinary process according to international law. I would also like to say that June 21st of 2023, the ICHR expressed its concern about the measures taken against operators of justice, especially the prosecutor Soraiva Aravalo, her due process of law being undermined. Now, the ICHR also requested information of the state of Peru about disciplinary processes that were started against the special team of prosecutors on Lava Jato going back to May of this year. In May, a specific investigation is going to or had been started against some of the operators of justice. Now, under this monitoring function, I would say that the Commission has always stated that the mechanism or device of a constitutional accusation that is leveled against a civil servant of the judiciary strikes out against the balance of power. Now, we have tried to respond to requests for precautionary measures on a timely basis, such as José Domingo Pérez and Rafael Barba and his immediate family. Now, I bring this up because civil society has also said that this hearing comes at a time a key moment in which the Commission wants to make clear that it is closely watching what is happening in Peru. And all of this is part of a bolstered oversight or that all of civil society, we've said to all of civil society that we are very much concerned, and we are going to bring to bear all the different instruments that the Commission has at its disposal. Right now, there's an open dialogue with the state, because what has been put on the table here is our ability to look into there being created a mechanism to for following up on the recommendations issued to the state. And it's in that dialogue that we will say now that any information we receive is going to be a part of those talks that we ultimately hold, such that we can address the concerns and identify those aspects that might jeopardize or lead to a weakening of institutions. I also have some questions I would like to ask of the state. What measures have the state has the state taken to ensure the function of specialized teams in charge of investigating cases of corruption at the highest level? I would also like to ask civil society, what is your assessment of the anti-corruption mechanisms that are currently in force in Peru? I thank you for the information in advance. I know that we never have enough time, and I'm sure the organizations have far more information to share, as well as the state. If the state would like to send any information in to us, the state can also do so in writing. The most important thing is that we keep open this dialogue with fluid exchange, so that our technical teams have been instructed to place top priority on things transpiring in Peru. I'll give the floor to Commissioner Aruchak. Thank you very much. I thank the different organizations who have been convened at this hearing. I greet the state of Peru. I see that you recognize the serious institutional crisis about which civil society has provided us information. On the one hand, it seems very positive to me that the role of the Attorney General's office be highlighted, its role in the defense of human rights. The Attorney General's office plays a very important role to ensure access to justice, to fight against impunity, and to avoid arbitrary cases in which people are criminalized arbitrarily. Now, sometimes we talk about the judiciary, the judicial branch, but now more focus is being placed on the role of the Office of the Attorney General. I think that's very positive. Something else I view that is positive is that this be done in institutional level. The whole administration of justice, not just a situation of certain persons who might be persecuted, or whether people are fulfilling their functions, but the bodies themselves, which sometimes are part of the problem in seeking out justice or to fight against corruption. So then I have some questions based on the comments we have heard from the state and from civil society. We've learned of a draft declaration, two draft declarations of an emergency that the Attorney General's office has submitted to the Congress that would call for the declaration of emergency for a given period of time and to suspend the Attorney General. I would like to learn from you what the status of that bill of law is right now and what your stance on it is. Now, you also raised a draft reform of the organic law of the Attorney General's office and what the citizens, what opportunities are there for citizens to have a hand in this process? Will workers also be able to express their views on this? To what degree? And what are the criteria that will be taken into account in assessing this draft bill of law? You referred to the criterion of efficiency. That's great. What others do you have? What parameters of human rights are also part of what is going to be taken up? Now, regarding the Office of the Attorney General, the representative thereof, my question would be, what are the opportunities for citizen participation in the public ministry or the Attorney General's office? I understand that the Office of the Attorney General wants to strengthen its, enhance its transparency, its openness, its legitimacy. So what institutional mechanisms does it have to engage in a dialogue outside organizations and that are concerned about what's happening now? For civil society organizations, I would they ask for strengthened oversight bodies or mechanisms. Which ones are you suggesting? I'm sure that's going to be included in your prayer for relief or your request. We are eager to hear. Thank you, Commissioner Pochak. Special Rapporteur of Freedom of Expression, Pedro Vaca. Thank you very much. I would like to greet through you the whole Commission, my colleagues from the Executive Secretariat, civil society organizations, and the State of Peru. I would also like to express thanks for the information expressed. I would like to focus on a number of topics that have been addressed.
El primero relacionado con
Now, regarding threats and intimidations, allegations of threats and intimidation against prosecutors and other members of the Attorney General's office, as raised by civil society, I would imagine that investigations underway of public interest about cases of violations of human rights on that. Now, when you are part of a public body charged with looking into this type of irregularity, and then there are threats made, I think there's a certain expectation that those threats be dealt with by the state writ large. I would ask the state and civil society if there are public statements made speaking out against those threats, and also what measures for protection, what investigations have been launched looking into those threats, and also the doxing of information, dissemination of people's private information, which then is used for harassing and intimidating people, and also disciplinary measures adopted against prosecutors, and to what degree any of that is subject to sanctions. Now, in the context of democratic crises, the Commission has placed emphasis on the freedom of expression of operators of justice, and I would ask if the state is aware of those standards issued by the Commission, and we would be happy to make them available to you if you aren't aware. Now, given that these are cases of corruption and grave cases of human rights violations, it's also important to take into account that the society has a public interest in being informed is common in a democratic system. When there are findings, when when information is dug up by journalists and so forth, I would like to ask the state and civil society if these disciplinary proceedings against prosecutors, if they have been kept up over time throughout the course of the investigations, or if rather they are raised after the fact, after changes have been made within the Office of the Attorney General. Sometimes interviews by the media were given. They didn't raise any hackles at the time, but then after a turnover of office holders in the Office of Attorney General or other bodies that take part in these disciplinary proceedings are then used retroactively to substantiate that persecution. So these disciplinary processes sometimes seem to be triggered after a turnover of authorities. I would also like to say that The freedom of expression is something that is absolutely important for everyone. And the inter-American system calls for compliance of certain thresholds to that have to be met for any restriction or structure to be placed on one's freedom of expression. I would like to know what the state has held up as what the criteria are, the necessity and proportionality and other such matters.
Muchas gracias por la participación. Yo voy a...
Thank you, Rapporteur. I'm going to take a brief moment to share a thought and ask a question. The thought has to do with the role played by the organs of the inter-American system in democratic institutions or democratic institutional framework, and for having institutions for the protection of human rights. It's very important that there be independence, balance, and checks and balances. That's why it's so important in the process of designations to make sure that the constitutional procedures are clear for designating judicial officers, for example, and we've seen judicial elections in Bolivia, also elections of Attorney General in Colombia and Honduras, and then we also see how these institutions can be preserved when it comes to removing judicial officers. The case of Martinez Esquivia against Colombia, Rios Avalos against Paraguay at the Inter-American Court, and a Peruvian case, all involving the removal of Supreme Court judges. In that vein, it seems to me very important that this be absolutely public, the appointments as well as any impeachment-related issues. In that regard, I want to ask, I have several questions. One for the state. Could you expound on the action of the Congress vis-a-vis the National Justice Board? On 25 September, the Commission issued a press release urging this and warning about the undue use of legal oversight mechanisms with respect to judicial officers. The other issue with the state is this idea of the provisional nature of prosecutors, this non-ratification so as to have permanent prosecutors, but rather having provisional prosecutors, and this whole idea of recurring to provisional and not permanent prosecutors, which has been addressed by civil society organizations as well. Now, for the civil society groups, I want to ask you about precautionary measures granted by the Inter-American Commission when these things happen, and whether in this whole situation there might be some institutional design that might go against the convention, if you noted that, and that does not, say, do justice to democratic institutional framework. Those two issues, please. Very well. So now we will go back to civil society for 12 minutes. Thank you very much, commissioners. I'd like to briefly note before I note our petitions, our relief sought, I do want to say something about something that was said by the state. This meeting of the Commission on Reform, these are meetings of a sort that have been happening for some time in the country, but unfortunately they don't have any impact in the way of reforms that actually promote reforms to the justice, for the independence of justice. What the state referred to was without civil society participation, and indeed to this day we don't know if there's going to be a new meeting or if there's anything new in the follow-up. We're also concerned that state institutions have not firmly indicated the concern about a bill that seeks to interfere with the independence and the autonomy of the Attorney General's office. With respect to the Attorney General's office, I think it's going to be very important, for example, to be able to promote a policy of defense for those prosecutors who are victims of smear campaigns and disinformation campaigns by those being investigated. And finally, in terms of the national authority that for oversight of the Attorney General's office, we're concerned about the guarantees of appearance that could be indicated. Let us recall that the head of this national authority, Mr. Juan Antonio Fernandez, has met with members of Congress who are being investigated by the Office of the Attorney General when this is prohibited by law. Next, our relief sought. We seek presentation of the report on the situation in Peru to the Permanent Council of the OAS. Second, to maintain monitoring over the stigmatization, harassment, and criminalization of prosecutors in Peru, and to continue make public statements about interference with the autonomy of the Attorney General's office. We also urge the Commission to assess and context acts such as to study and grant precautionary measures. And third, bearing in mind the grave situation and the democratic and crisis of democracy and human rights in the country, the follow-up on the actions of the Commission and the recent release of Alberto Fujimori in open contempt of the Inter-American Court, we ask that Commission consider putting Peru in Chapter 4B in its next annual report, the 2024 annual report. To continue stating what we seek to the executive, for the Commissioner put it on the table once again, the goodwill of the Commission to implement follow-up mechanism. This was reiterated in the hearing held last year, November. I'd like it if the state could accept and do what needs to be done in order to immediately implement that mechanism. And to that end, it's also important to invite the Inter-American Commission on a working visit to set all this in motion. We ask the Congress to refrain from making abusive use of impeachment mechanisms against judicial officers, including supreme prosecutors. The judiciary, we ask the judiciary to timely resolve the cases pending that allege negative actions against the independence of the Attorney General's office. The Attorney General's office, we ask that it continue to speak out publicly in defense of its own autonomy and of prosecutors, particularly those in positions covering cases of greater public interest, to make sure that the citizens are protected in their right to be informed and guarantee the right to expression of prosecutors. Third, to undertake the investigations about acts of stigmatization, harassment, and threats directed against prosecutors on a current basis, this in keeping with Inter-American standards. Fourth, to consider reforms to diminish the number of provisional positions so as to removal of those prosecutors who are investigating corruption at key points in their investigations with no justification. Now, the national authority, please adapt the exercise of your disciplinary powers to international principles having to do with autonomy of prosecutors, prohibition of sanction due to the content of their decisions, and other similar considerations. Finally, the member states of the OAS, we ask you to keep your eyes open to the situation of rule of law in Peru and to monitor measures so as to avoid any further deepening of the democratic crisis in Peru. I'd like to refer briefly to the issue of the freedom of expression of prosecutors. We understand that in circumstances such as those described in this hearing, it's much more fundamental that prosecutors who give opinions on structural issues not be punished for the exercise of their freedom of expression. Of course, as public officials, they have certain restrictions, and as prosecutors, they have some specific restrictions when it comes to referring to specific cases. But even in the context of the cases they investigate, there's a duty, not only a right to inform, but a duty to do so truthfully and for the citizens to know the status of investigation so long as one keeps the investigation under seal and also protects any other rights involved. So we want to ask that the National Oversight Authority review and establish guidelines for such sanctions in keeping with the standards for justice operators or judicial officers. Now, just a couple of issues. First, to respond to the concern of Commissioner Ralón having to do with the efficacy and efficiency of the anti-corruption mechanisms in Peru. Here, I want to say that if you evaluate the Peruvian mechanisms for fighting corruption and you compare them or look at them in the regional context, clearly progress has been made. The criminal prosecution of persons with power in Peru shows major steps forward, as well as the use of strategies and mechanisms relevant for prosecuting corruption. For example, the use of what is called effective collaboration, the use of asset forfeiture, the role and the powers that have been given to the Financial Intelligence Unit in Peru, the very institutional design for going after organized crime and corruption offenses. Clearly, there are gains, and if you look at Peru in the regional context, there are certainly lessons learned to be shared with other countries of the region. Now, having said this, of course, there are weaknesses. There is no perfect institution, and clearly the anti-corruption mechanisms in Peru have serious weaknesses, beginning with the delay in decision-making and in getting to the judgments, but these will have to be addressed within the prosecutorial institution. Second, I'd like to recall the words of the Human Rights Ombudsperson as to the next process for selecting members of the National Justice Board. I pick up on what you have said, and I recall what I told you when I saw you in Lima, which is that we're going to be sending an international observation mission to observe the process of selecting members of the National Justice Board. This is a very important process, not only for democracy and the rule of law in Peru, but for the whole region. And that's it. Yes, you next. Just to speak to one last point, one of the points made about precautionary measures, or question about precautionary measures put by Commissioner Caballero. Precautionary measures in the case of justice operators in Peru have been crucial for keeping them in their positions so that they can continue performing their prosecutorial functions. Nonetheless, we do consider that a large part of their being besieged today, for example, in the case of José Domingo Pérez, from 2018 to date, he has more than 80 disciplinary, criminal, and constitutional accusations or denunciations, and this takes any amount of time to see who can counsel him. This wears him down. It has a negative impact on him and his family, on his rights. And unfortunately, that criminalization that Prosecutor José Domingo, like so many others, face in Peru is not addressed in the precautionary measure. We do think that the Commission could undertake a contextual analysis, mindful that many of these proceedings open up with fake news and stigmatization, and this could be considered such that the precautionary measure could be broader in scope. I wanted to round out, since we still have 2 more minutes, I wanted to round out one issue on precautionary measures that involves the work of the Commission and the Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression, because it's clear that no one should be criminalized for exercising protected conduct. For example, reporting on where a proceeding stands. Even though the domestic rule prohibits it, that goes against international standards. In situations such as this, I think it would be very important for the rapporteurship and the Commission to go forward in defining, first, a policy vis-a-vis this issue, and second, to make explicit the prohibition of disciplinary criminal prosecution for engaging in protected conduct. Now, at the same time, the Inter-American Court and the UN system as well, there's been interesting development on the issuance of precautionary measures to get certain types of criminal or disciplinary proceedings to come to a halt. And the Commission could also consider this in reviewing its institutional response to things such as this. Thank you. Very well, civil society. The state now has the floor for 12 minutes, please. Thank you, Chair. Just to reiterate that in Peru, we respect the autonomy of each branch of government and of the various autonomous entities. Within this framework, the government maintains a position of respect for all other entities. I don't want to go on at length because I think that there are many issues that should be addressed directly by the others who are here. That's why I'd like to give the floor to Juan Carlos Bien Campana, who is the Attorney General.
Quiero referirme puntualmente.
I'd like to refer to two specific aspects that are very important. I heard a moment ago, it was asked, what measures had been taken in relation to the high-level investigations. The Attorney General's Office of Peru, it has the following competences as established in our Code of Criminal Procedure. That the Attorney General of the nation should investigate the high-level officials of the Republic included in Article 99 of the Constitution. These are President of the Republic, state ministers, supreme judges, supreme prosecutors, members of the National Judicial Council, Human Rights Ombudsman, and Comptroller General of the Republic. We've realized, we have, in a public communication, we noted that we have more than 300 investigations underway, many of them against members of Congress of the Republic. We are working, and we have presented to date, in these 2.5 months, since I've been at the head on an interim basis of the Office of Attorney General, 11 constitutional complaints. And the investigations are of the utmost importance because not only do they involve cases of corruption of officials, but also investigations having to do with human rights violations. You'll recall that we also have a special team that has been investigating the events of December 2022 having to do with the social protests. So in the area of constitutional complaints and illicit enrichment of the Attorney General's office, we have these investigations. Moreover, I would like to state that as regards the designation of provisional prosecutors, the Attorney General's office in effect has more than 50% provisional prosecutors. We have drawn up an updated table with absolute transparency to submit to the National Justice Board that has all of the openings for appointing full prosecutors. Now, the competitive processes haven't taken place in the last 4 or 5 years, and this has also been noted in the National Justice Board for reasons having to do with budget. This has given rise to those levels of provisional prosecutors. Nonetheless, the provisional prosecutors are designated by the Attorney General's office and also in this period based on certain criteria. Many of them, more than 1,000, are assistants in the prosecutorial functions, but they've worked in our institution. They've been doing so for several years. They have training. Their work is reviewed. Their academic background is reviewed. Also, they're trained at the judge at another institution, and then they're adjuncts. Also, there's the priority that all lower-ranking full or adjunct prosecutors who are permanent should be designated as, or full, are designated as provincial prosecutors, and the provincial ones are designated to be designated as superior prosecutors. Similarly, the supreme prosecutors, both transitory and provisional ones, have been designated, mindful of their history, their seniority, and their experience. Nonetheless, from the outset of my term, we have wanted to convert the transitory supreme prosecutorial positions into permanent ones so that these positions of transitory supreme and provisional supreme prosecutors can become full Supreme Prosecutors, and they can become part of the Board of Supreme Prosecutors, thereby governing strengthening this governing body. We have asked for technical reports, and we have yet to conclude this decision. We hope to be able to have a final decision in coming days, and we will inform public opinion accordingly. Now, as for the other prosecutorial positions, we're also working in organic law for the Attorney General's office, which is entrusted to a commission that has been established, made up of prosecutors of all levels and offices, but as Espinosa is going to provide more details on this. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, commissioners and all present. Very specifically, given time considerations, we cannot go on at such length. I simply want to note that on occasion of the designation of this major commission that brings together all of the prosecutors of the country, one representative from each prosecutorial district, a major initiative has been undertaken to draw up a modern and efficient law, organic law on the Attorney General's office. This is not the first effort along these lines. In 2019, the then prosecutor, Zoraida Rivera, presented an interesting bill to the Congress. And we must say this, unfortunately, there have always been obstacles put up by the political powers when it comes to evaluating, studying, analyzing a draft of this importance and scope. Now, given what's happened, a new organic law in the Attorney General's office is going to be drawn up that's going to take into account all of the current perspectives, human rights, gender perspective, in the first title, in the principles we're going to incorporate, and also having to do with tenure and autonomy at the Attorney General's office. This is what we can do to what we have to say in response to some of the concerns that were raised. Very well, with respect to the legislative initiatives to declare Attorney General's office an emergency, we've rejected this because they're unconstitutional and arbitrary. The idea is to break down the constitutional and democratic order, violate the constitutional rule of law, the autonomy and independence of the Attorney General's office, and separation of powers. What many projects would seek would be to remove the prosecutors from all levels and administrative personnel to avoid and frustrate the investigations to high-level state officials. These investigations are entrusted to the Office of the Attorney General, the Supreme Prosecutors, the special prosecutorial teams such as Lava Jato, White Collar, victims of social protest, corruption in power, and others. These investigations are currently underway. We thank the prosecutor. Madam Prosecutor, I need to now give the floor to the Human Rights Ombudsman. Thank you. Thank you very much. Greetings to Mr. Viena, the Minister of Justice, through you, Chair, and through the Commission. I would like to go back to 2018, when the National Judicial Council was dissolved and the National Judicial Board, or National Justice Board, was established on 19 February 2019. The current National Justice Board was installed. One of its greatest accomplishments has been the designation of three magistrates who are supreme prosecutors. Two of them are with us today, Viena and Espinosa. And another of those elected at that time, Patricia Benavides. And Paulo Sanchez. So the same National Justice Board designated the head of the National Authority for Oversight of the Attorney General's Office and the Judicial Branch. In other words, so we need to be very careful. Everything that we might see as bad today isn't so bad, because I do believe in the probity and honesty of those designated. And were there any excess, our constitutional rule of law has the remedies necessary so as to address the situation appropriately. That is why we will always say that the truth always has to be free, because this is always a matter of principles. Now, having noted this, and I must say the other point with respect to the questions that have been raised, oftentimes there's talk of the bills presented to the legislature by the 130 members of Congress. These are bills, and that's their constitutional prerogative. Now, as regards those that are harmful to the public interest or constitutional rule of law, the Office of the Human Rights Ombudsman has always voiced its opposition and has always been contrary to any abuse of power. Nonetheless, it must be recognized that is a constitutional prerogative of legislators to propose any bill which they think might be valid. Nonetheless, we believe that when the majority adopts a position to pass it into law, should always be, is the most appropriate way to uphold democracy in our country. As regards investigations in anti-corruption proceedings, we are concerned about that, Chair. It's been more than 10 years and there's no judgment. It's been more than 10 years and we have not even gotten to the oral trial stage. To comment on just one important case, how the state, through a local government, reached agreement with a private person to prejudice millions of Peruvians on a daily basis, putting their hands in the pockets of the people to steal their money. This is incredible. This being the case, the Office of the Human Rights Ombudsman must be firm in seeing to it that the constitutional rule of law is preserved, and not only preserved, but also maintained as a guarantee of freedom, as a guarantee of living together in peace, which is the culture that we are seeking. Just a few final words for Ms. Ortiz, if possible. I'd like to thank you all to afford this opportunity. The National Oversight Authority will continue to work without answering to any interest or any interference to end impunity in official acts that constitute misconduct. We reiterate our commitment to continue fighting corruption and to continue promoting a culture of integrity in the prosecutorial service so as to guarantee democracy, proper imparting of justice, and the confidence of the citizenry. Thank you very much. We are grateful for this opportunity, and we salute the presence of the Minister of Justice and Human Rights. And we are ready and willing to submit any further report to answer the concerns raised here, mindful that it's very difficult in this short time to say everything that needs to be said. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and we'll so proceed. I now give the floor to Commissioner Ralón, who's asked for the floor as we head to a close. Thank you very much, Chair. Very briefly, I'd like to thank the parties for their statements and answers. It was said that this hearing has come at a crucial moment. So I would like to take advantage in these closing moments to issue an appeal to all of the different parts of the Peruvian state to ensure that there's rigorous respect for rule of law in the proceedings that have been opened up, that are ongoing. Only in this way will it be possible to guarantee the independence and autonomy of the different authorities, particularly the National Justice Board and the Attorney General's Office. Further, I'd like to reiterate the willingness to establish a roundtable for follow-up, to follow up on the recommendations in the country report. We've been in discussions with the Peruvian state. It has shown that it is open and willing. So it would be more than timely to have a specific follow-up mechanism for Peru. So I state this, as the Commissioner stated before, that we could go forward along those lines. Thank you very much. We have just a couple of minutes left if you wanted to say something. Thank you very much, Commissioner. We'd like to underscore that the Peruvian situation is very complicated, and from civil society, we're concerned about any number of points beyond those, including some that we've not mentioned. We are concerned that proper guarantees are not given of appearance, independence, and impartiality. For example, the commission that is going to elect the National Justice Board is made up of the President of the Constitutional Court. And we are concerned that the members of that commission and the person who is chairing it have not made any clear pronouncement as to how we, the citizens, can be guaranteed that a member of that board who chairs the Constitutional Court has ruled against a judgment of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in the case of the illegal release of Alberto Fujimori. There's no guarantee for the citizens, and accordingly, in that process of selecting the new board, that supranational standards will be respected. Also, another point to cast light on just how serious it is, what's happening in Peru, is that the Attorney General's office faces the great challenges of continuing to investigate paradigmatic cases such as white-collar case. Yet we are concerned to see the Minister of Justice alongside the Office of the Attorney General when the Minister himself is being investigated for this case by the Attorney General's office. So we're concerned about the appearance of independence in such investigations. That, I think, is a permanent challenge, and we ask that the Commission bear it in mind to pay attention to the petitions that civil society has presented on urgent basis. Thank you. Same time for the state and its representatives. 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Certainly, issues are being raised that don't really fall within this hearing. They're not related to this hearing. And the Peruvian state already has a date for responding to some of these points at the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. I think that is where that topic should be taken up. In addition, the presence of the minister is to support the position of the Peruvian state with regard to the integrity of the Attorney General's office. The Peruvian state last year gave $90 million additional to the Attorney General's office to implement human rights prosecutorial entities. We're talking about more or less $3 million for a $23 million. And the Human Rights Ombudsman wishes to speak again. Just to let you know that in January of this year, the President of the National Justice Board, Antonio de la Asa, asked the Office of the Human Rights Ombudsman to begin the steps for this process to go forward. Now, the Superintendency of Universities in Peru has been asked to accredit the two representatives, one from public universities and the other from private universities. That was already done, and now we have asked the National Office on Election Processes to certify both representatives. In about 20 more days, we'll have the first working meeting on a collegial basis. And I give you my word today, I know both who are going to be designated, I know all the members, and I know that they are all very suitable, representative, and legitimate, and they deserve heading up each of these entities, and they can't really be called into question. Well, one can make a critical analysis, but their integrity, their personal situation cannot be called into question. Thank you very much.
Lima is requesting the floor. We're going to have to conclude. Just a minute. 1 minute, please. Thank you. I would just like to refer to what the Ombudsman's defender of the people said on this. We need to be very specific on concrete cases. The Office of the Attorney General does not have the last word in what happens to a given case. There are many cases in which indictments have been issued and are pending trial. Another very important topic is that the Congress of the Republic is a part of the system of justice. We have many constitutional charges brought. There's a case that has been around for 5 years that the Congress has not followed through on, and it has been returned after 5 years, which is the period of protection that exists, and that is the reason for the delay. I'm referring specifically to the white-collar cases. These are complaints lodged, and they're before the Congress and have not been followed up on. Thank you. We thank everyone for the information, for this exchange, for coming to the Commission. Thank you very much for this hearing. It is adjourned.